Welcome. Tonight, we're going to settle in for uh, a calm and I think quite thorough exploration of the Turkish economy.
It's a financial landscape that's just full of these remarkable
It
contradictions.
really is. We've gathered, well, quite a rich stack of sources for this deep dive. We have decades of historical data, a lot of recent geopolitical analysis, and some very detailed macroeconomic reviews.
And our aim really is to just move slowly through this material to reflect on the deeper currents of both the instability and the incredible potential that seem to define this nation.
Exactly. So let's begin with what we're calling our quiet hook. It's a paradox, really, and it's centered entirely on the year 2022.
It does present a fascinating intellectual puzzle.
It does, because if you just look at the official economic numbers on paper, Turkey appeared to be having this moment of outstanding domestic success.
Mm-hmm.
The government recorded really robust GDP growth, expanding by about 5.6%. And maybe even more strikingly, the Istanbul stock market it soared.
It tripled.
It tripled in value over the course of that one single year. That suggests a profound internal vitality, a lot of confidence from investors.
On the surface.
But yes, if you look just beneath that surface of growth, the very foundation of financial stability was, well, it was visibly cracking.
In that exact same year, 2022.
In that same year, the most fundamental measure of a modern economy, its currency, was in a complete freefall. The Turkish lira lost approximately half of its value against the US dollar.
Just within those 12 months. And at the same time, official consumer inflation it was skyrocketing. It climbed above 80% annually.
So this is the quiet tension, the intellectual question we want to guide you through tonight. How is it possible?
How can an economy show such powerful, tangible signs of expansion? Rapid construction, high consumption, a booming stock market, while at the exact same moment, the national currency is being so violently eroded.
It's just destroying the value of savings.
Exactly. This duality, where this apparent prosperity coexists with such a systemic, profound instability. It really suggests that the economic activity wasn't being driven by confidence in the future.
No.
It was being driven by a deep-seated anxiety about the present.
Okay, so let's unpack that. We need to follow the historical thread because the context for all of this instability is it's rooted deep in history. To really appreciate the recent volatility, we have to go back.
We do. We have to look at the period before the major reforms that followed Turkey's economic crisis in 2001.
Right.
And, prior to that pivotal moment, the Turkish economy had been struggling for decades. It was plagued by these two chronic ailments, excessive external debt, and this chronically high runaway inflation.
And we're not talking about, 10 or 15% inflation.
No. We are talking about inflation rates that at times surpassed 120% per year.
Just imagine that for a moment. Your money losing more than half its value every year.
The constant devaluation meant that the currency, the old Turkish lira, it essentially failed to function as a reliable store of value. It made economic life extremely difficult, very confusing for ordinary citizens.
So that crisis in 2001, born from that instability, it really acted as a kind of a harsh reset button. It forced a commitment to financial orthodoxy.
It did. And the initial phase of that reform was centered on some pretty painful austerity.
Our sources detail the scale of those cuts to government spending. Before the reform, the government's budget deficit was just crippling. It was standing at over 16% of GDP.
16%. It's an almost unbelievable number for a national budget.
It is.
But the initial commitment to fixing it was impressive. Through very aggressive spending restraint and fiscal discipline, that monumental deficit was brought down dramatically. It stabilized at just 2% of GDP by 2005.
That was a critical first step.
Yeah.
It was a signal to international lenders, to the world, that the Turkish government was finally serious about managing its own books responsibly.
But the fiscal cuts, while absolutely necessary, were really only half the story.
Right. The truly crucial institutional step was the restructuring of the central bank.
This is key.
Around 2001, Turkey committed to granting the central bank formal legal independence. And this was a monumental move. It was designed to signal that the management of monetary policy, controlling the money supply, setting interest rates, would be managed by apolitical economists, not by the shifting tides of political demands.
And the results of that institutional change, they were almost immediate and very dramatic.
They were. With that new political mandate to fight inflation, the central bank was finally able to stabilize prices. Inflation just dropped rapidly from those triple-digit figures down to single digits. It hit a manageable 8% by 2005.
And that move alone restored a fundamental baseline of trust in the nation's ability to manage its finances.
It did. And that new stability was then confirmed with a very practical but also highly symbolic act.
The new Turkish lira.
Exactly. In 2005, Turkey introduced the new Turkish lira. And this was more than just a name change. They literally erased 6 zeros from the currency. 1 million old lira became one new lira.
Precisely. It simplified transactions, of course, but more importantly, it was a psychological reset. It helped to convince people that the national currency could, once again, function as a medium of exchange and a reliable store of value.
Which is truly the essential fundamental tool for any modern functioning economy. You have to have that trust.
You have to. And this successful reset, it ushered in what is now widely regarded as Turkey's golden age of growth, a period lasting roughly from 2003 all the way through to about 2017.
The growth figures from that time are just staggering to look back on.
They really are. Turkish GDP nearly tripled during this period. It was driven by massive investment and, importantly, easy credit. Annual growth rates were often exceeding 7%.
Which was substantially outpacing developing Europe and the Eurozone, which, was struggling through its own phases of stagnation at the time.
It was. And this is where the unique geography of Turkey paid enormous dividends.
Our sources really emphasize this point. Turkey's strategic position acting as this essential global bridge.
It's irreplaceable. It sat right between the high-demand consumer markets of Europe, the rapidly growing manufacturing centers of Asia, and, of course, the vast energy and natural resource wealth of the Middle East and Russia.
This centrality made it, well, an irresistible destination for global capital that was looking for high returns.
And that capital flowed in, mainly in the form of foreign direct investment, or FDI. By 2006, FDI inflows were averaging about $10 billion per year.
Which was a huge, direct signal of renewed international confidence.
Absolutely. And this boom wasn't confined to, corporate balance sheets or government reports. It fundamentally changed the quality of life for millions of Turks.
You see that in the social data. The national poverty rate just plummeted. It went from 42% in 2003
32%.
down to just 14% by 2013. A massive shift.
A generational shift. And the domestic construction and real estate sectors, they flourished. Critically, through new systems of mortgage lending, homeownership became accessible to ordinary families, many for the first time in generations.
Yet, as so often happens in these rapid expansions, vulnerabilities were quietly being baked into the system.
That's right. While the government had done a very good job cleaning up its own balance sheet, the private sector, the banks, the manufacturers, the real estate developers, they were rapidly accumulating external liabilities.
And this structural flaw leads us straight into what our sources call the dependency trap.
That is the core structural issue. Despite all the impressive growth, Turkey maintained a high consumption, low savings model.
So the population was consuming more than the country was collectively producing.
Exactly. This structural deficit resulted in a large and, importantly, a chronic current account deficit. This just means Turkey was consistently importing more than it exported.
And especially importing essential commodities that it couldn't produce itself, like energy and gold.
Right, and this chronic gap, this necessity of consuming beyond the country's means, it had to be financed somehow.
And the mechanism for financing that gap became heavy overseas borrowing.
Yes, because global interest rates, particularly in the US and Europe, were held at historically low levels, especially after the 2008 financial crisis. This created a powerful financial incentive.
For what's known as the carry trade.
Precisely. It encouraged local Turkish banks and private companies to engage heavily in this practice. Instead of borrowing in local lira, which carried higher domestic interest rates because of, persistent inflation expectations.
They borrowed massive amounts of capital in foreign currencies, US dollars and euros, at ultra-low rates from abroad.
This strategy generated higher immediate profits for sure, but it introduced a massive and ultimately fateful currency risk into the entire system.
And that currency risk became the structural ticking time bomb.
It did. Our sources show that by 2019, Turkey's external debt, which was largely held by the private sector, not the government, had climbed to over 55% of GDP.
And since this enormous debt was denominated in foreign currency, the structural risk was clear.
The risk was that any significant depreciation of the lira would instantly, drastically inflate the debt burden when you measured it in lira terms.
Let's just walk through that for a second. If a Turkish company borrowed, say, $1 billion, and the lira suddenly lost half its value against the dollar, that company's debt liability, in terms of the domestic currency it earns, would double overnight.
Instantly. This threat was not theoretical. It risked triggering mass defaults across the entire private, corporate, and banking sector if a currency crisis were to escalate.
So this dependency became the fragile pivot point for everything that was to follow.
It really did, and it sets the stage perfectly for the dramatic economic shifts that came next, which were driven by a sharp political consolidation and the adoption of some highly unorthodox economic policies.
Policies that fundamentally broke with that central bank independence that had been established back in 2001.
Right. This shift really gained momentum following the 2017 constitutional referendum. That referendum significantly consolidated presidential power.
And this political centralization allowed the head of state to exert far greater control over what had been historically independent state institutions, directly impacting the central bank.
And this political control was underpinned by a very powerful ideological framework.
The president famously adhered to a specific interpretation of Islamic finance, holding that high interest rates are fundamentally usurious and immoral.
Yes, we see this articulated very clearly in the sources. He famously called interest rates the mother and father of all evils.
This ideological conviction then led to a policy framework that stood in direct opposition to, well, nearly all mainstream economic theory.
It's a complete inversion, whereas conventional economics dictates that you raise interest rates to curb inflation by cooling down demand.
You make borrowing more expensive so people and companies spend less.
Exactly. The unorthodox view was the opposite, that cutting interest rates would, in fact, reduce inflation.
Okay, let's just pause on that because it's so counterintuitive.
Mm.
If the central bank cuts rates, the argument is that this stimulates growth. It makes borrowing cheaper, which leads to increased investment and production. And the theory being proposed here is that the resulting increase in the supply of goods would outpace demand growth, and that would bring prices down, even while the economy is still expanding.
Precisely. It is a very unusual approach that fundamentally relies on rapid supply-side expansion to correct for demand-side price pressures, rather than simply tightening credit. And this belief provided the philosophical justification for forcing rate cuts even as inflation began to spiral out of control.
So the moment this structural fragility, all that private dollar debt, collided with this ideological policy, that moment arrived around 2018.
It did. It came when the U.S. Federal Reserve began its cycle of raising interest rates.
That external shock was the trigger.
It was. Higher U.S. rates made dollar-based assets much more attractive globally, and this caused the foreign investors who had been financing Turkey's current account deficit to lose confidence in Turkish assets and rapidly pull their capital out.
The scale of this capital flight was significant.
It was huge. Turkey experienced a net loss of $8.7 billion USD in capital in a single year.
And this loss created a devastating feedback loop for the lira.
A classic feedback loop. The sudden reduction in demand for the currency caused its value to plummet. It lost around 40% against the dollar in 2018 alone.
And because of that dependency trap we just discussed, that currency depreciation immediately compounded the debt crisis.
Right. The real cost of the private sector's massive foreign-denominated debt, all those dollars they'd borrowed so cheaply, suddenly became exponentially more expensive in lira terms. It drove corporate balance sheets toward insolvency.
Now, the conventional playbook here is obvious. An aggressive, immediate interest rate hike to stabilize the currency, attract foreign capital back.
It's Econ 101 for an emerging market crisis.
But given the ideological opposition, the president insisted on rate cuts, or at the very least, stagnation. And this created a profound institutional conflict that, well, it led to political chaos.
It was a full-blown institutional breakdown, a visible sign to the entire market that the rules of the game had changed.
We see this in the turnover at the top. Between 2019 and 2023, the head of state fired 4 different central bank governors.
4 governors in 4 years. All of them had attempted to exercise their independence by raising interest rates to combat the soaring inflation.
And that level of institutional turnover, it sent a seismic signal to both local and international investors.
The signal was unmistakable. The post-2001 independence of the bank was completely gone. Monetary policy was now firmly political.
And as one economist in our sources noted, that lack of independence signaled a complete departure from established norms. It essentially undermined the very credibility you need to manage a volatile currency.
You can't manage a currency without credibility.
No. So let's transition now into how the government attempted to manage the resulting currency chaos, specifically focusing on this problem of dollarization.
This phenomenon of dollarization became a fascinating macro-level problem. It was an unexpected consequence of a policy that was initially meant to protect citizens.
Right. Earlier regulations had made it very easy for Turkish citizens and companies to open foreign currency bank accounts.
And the intention was protective. The idea was if your savings were held in a hard currency like dollars or euros, they would be cushioned against the lira's frequent drops. This was especially important since so much private debt was already dollar-denominated.
But this well-intentioned policy ironically became a mechanism for continuous systemic destabilization.
It did, because whenever the lira began its downward slide, Turks, whether they were ordinary savers with a small nest egg or large corporations, could instantly and easily move their wealth out of the depreciating lira.
And into dollars, all while keeping the money inside their domestic bank accounts.
And this created a massive, reflexive, and almost continuous selling pressure on the lira. Every single drop in value triggered a rapid shift, which in turn pushed the currency even further down.
This behavior made the lira far more volatile, and it just destroyed whatever remaining usefulness it had as a stable store of value.
And it cemented the nation's reliance on foreign currency for any kind of stability.
So in late 2021, facing massive public confidence issues and continuing capital flight, the government introduced its flagship countermeasure. This was the lirization strategy.
It was an attempt to make holding lira deposits attractive again by protecting them from those wild currency swings, but crucially without actually raising interest rates.
The mechanism was, well, it was highly complex, and as our sources suggest, ultimately destructive.
It was. Savers who agreed to keep their money in lira deposits for a minimum period were guaranteed a bonus payment from the government.
And this bonus was equal to the decline in the lira's value against the US dollar or euro over that period.
In essence, the government was offering a currency hedge, ensuring that the deposit holder would not lose purchasing power due to devaluation.
So just to be clear, if you deposited 10,000 lira and the lira then lost 30% of its value during the term of your deposit,
You would receive your interest plus a bonus payment of 3,000 lira from the government, directly compensating you for that loss of value.
the intention was to restore trust and keep savings denominated in lira. But the counter effect was catastrophic for inflation.
It was. Because these guaranteed bonus payments weren't funded by tax revenue. They were sourced by the Treasury through money creation.
So they were printing money to pay for the scheme.
Essentially, yes. Since inflation was already high, that required massive compensation payments. So the government was constantly creating new money to pay the guaranteed bonuses.
And that created this perfect negative feedback loop. The solution designed to stabilize the currency was simultaneously and significantly increasing the money supply.
Which was fueling the very inflation and cost of living crisis it was designed to combat.
The scale of the financial liability this created for the government was enormous, and it was just growing rapidly alongside inflation.
And compounding these internal policy disasters was Turkey's enduring and critical vulnerability to external trade shocks.
Particularly its heavy reliance on imported energy.
A vulnerability that accelerated the crisis throughout 2022.
Turkey is a massive net importer of essential energy supplies, oil, natural gas.
These are commodities that have to be purchased on international markets, and critically, they must be paid for in hard currency, primarily US dollars.
Which means Turkey needs a constant, massive inflow of foreign currency simply to ensure the national economy can function and the lights stay on.
And then came the invasion of Ukraine in early 2022.
The resulting geopolitical instability caused global energy prices to soar.
And this external shock drastically worsened Turkey's already persistent trade deficit as the cost of these essential imports skyrocketed.
The financial implication was unavoidable and immediate.
It was. To pay the vastly increased price for essential energy imports, the Turkish government and state entities had to sell exponentially more lira on foreign exchange markets just to acquire the necessary dollars.
This overwhelming supply of lira being sold guaranteed that the currency would continue its rapid downward spiral throughout 2022. It compounded the domestic crisis that was already being caused by the low interest rate policy.
It was a perfect storm of internal policy mistakes meeting an unavoidable external price shock.
The confluence of all these factors, the ideological monetary policy, the massive capital flight, the destabilizing dollarization, and that energy price shock.
Yeah.
It created an absolutely impossible political situation.
Especially heading into the critical 2023 elections.
Exactly. The government was facing skyrocketing inflation, plummeting voter satisfaction, and a full-blown currency crisis. They definitely needed to stabilize the lira financially.
Yet, the president maintained his staunch ideological stance against raising interest rates to attract conventional foreign investment through, traditional means.
So the solution, as one analyst in our sources summarized it, required intense political acrobatics.
A very good term for it. Since Turkey couldn't attract capital through orthodox monetary policy, the leadership turned to regional energy exporters.
Nations that were suddenly flush with billions of dollars due to the high global energy prices.
Caused by the very same conflict that was destabilizing Turkey's economy. The irony is quite stark.
This required a dramatic and swift re-engagement with countries that had been, in some cases, bitter rivals.
It meant putting past hostilities aside very quickly. For example, diplomatic ties were rapidly restored with Israel, a former political rival, partly in the hope of future cooperation on energy independence.
Which would, in the long run, help address that fundamental trade deficit vulnerability.
And perhaps even more dramatically, Turkey rapidly repaired relations with the UAE and Saudi Arabia.
Two Gulf states that had been severe critics, even rivals, of Turkish foreign policy in previous years.
And the reconciliation with the UAE resulted in a substantial $4.9 billion currency swap deal, a very immediate injection of foreign currency relief.
They also secured major loans and investments from other regional heavyweights. This included $10 billion from Qatar, which has been a long-standing ally,
and a $5 billion investment from Saudi Arabia. Most notably, despite being a core NATO member, Turkey's trade with Russia exploded after the Ukraine invasion.
And they secured a massive $9.1 billion loan from Russia, specifically designated for the construction of a new nuclear power plant.
And the analysis here is crucial for understanding the modern political economic strategy.
Yes.
These highly unorthodox geopolitical strategies, they succeeded. They provided the necessary foreign currency, tens of billions of dollars, to temporarily prop up the lira and stabilize the exchange rate.
It provided a financial lifeline without requiring the government to conform to conventional monetary policy by raising rates.
That's the key. This maneuvering effectively bought the government critical time to survive the election cycle.
So while this political maneuvering stabilized the currency in the short term, the economic instability that came before it had already created a deep and lasting socioeconomic strain.
And it simultaneously masked the true financial turmoil beneath a layer of what we earlier called false prosperity.
Let's come back to that idea. This concept of false prosperity is key to understanding that 2022 paradox we started with.
It is. Why was GDP growing at 5.6% and the stock market tripling? It wasn't fueled by confidence, it was driven by fear.
Citizens, watching their cash savings rapidly lose 40% or more of their value annually due to inflation, engaged in, well, panic spending and investment.
They rushed to move their wealth out of a depreciating lira and into any asset that might retain value. Durable goods, stocks, real estate.
So this rush to buy things, anything, rather than hold cash, that's what drove consumption figures up and caused asset prices to soar.
Exactly. It created the illusion of a booming economy, but it was essentially anxiety-fueled consumption. It created no lasting wealth or genuine financial stability.
And the direct human impact on the working class was severe and immediate.
It was. Although minimum wages were adjusted multiple times, the increases did not remotely keep pace with the hyperinflation of basic necessities.
We see this reflected clearly in the price data. Inflation for housing hit 93%, and education prices soared over 100% in a very short period.
This rapid deterioration of purchasing power just made daily life profoundly difficult.
And the housing and rent crisis became a particularly acute burden for urban households.
Surveys from that time indicated that over half of all Turkish households reported spending more than half their monthly income just on rent.
Which pushes basic life to a point where it's, as one source put it, close to impossible for large segments of the population.
And average home prices in a city like Istanbul tripled in just 2 years. It created this massive new wealth disparity between homeowners and renters.
This immense pressure was only exacerbated by the catastrophic February 2023 earthquakes.
An almost unimaginable tragedy. The destruction of over 700,000 homes in the affected regions necessitated massive reconstruction efforts,
with costs estimated at a staggering $80 billion.
which is roughly 10% of the country's entire GDP. This emergency demand for building materials and labor further fueled construction costs, intensified the national housing shortage, and added immense pressure to the national budget.
One of the most severe long-term costs of all this instability has been the accelerating brain drain.
The loss of high-value human capital, yes. The economic turmoil and the sheer difficulty in maintaining a decent quality of life have led to a severe outflow of skilled workers. They're voting with their feet.
The statistics are concerning. For instance, our sources note more than 14,000 doctors have left the country.
Citing the inability to live on local wages and practice medicine in a stable environment.
And furthermore, studies show that 3/4 of the country's youth report that they are planning to move abroad in the near future.
And they cite the unstable economy and the lack of institutional certainty as the primary drivers for that decision.
This talent flight has profound negative consequences for Turkey's future productivity.
It absolutely does. Foreign firms are now citing political instability and, crucially, the lack of skilled workers as primary reasons for reducing their exposure or delaying major investments.
And that creates a vicious cycle, doesn't it?
It does. The talent loss makes Turkey less attractive to the high-quality foreign capital that would otherwise create the stable, high-paying jobs needed to convince young professionals to stay.
Despite these crippling, self-inflicted wounds and these profound structural challenges, it is essential, as we start to conclude, to reflect on Turkey's immense and enduring untapped potential.
And its growing geopolitical dominance. The strong fundamentals that existed during that golden age, they still persist today.
The country maintains a geographically advantageous position, and it possesses a large, young, skilled, and cost-competitive workforce.
Turkey sits as a crucial manufacturing hub. It offers labor costs that are often more competitive than its European neighbors, but it benefits from a highly skilled and educated base compared to many resource-rich countries to its east.
And its wealth of natural beauty and historical sites makes it a top global tourist destination.
That generates billions in foreign currency inflows, almost regardless of the domestic political climate. This robust tourism sector provides a vital, persistent source of hard currency that helps buffer some of the economic shocks.
And geopolitically, Turkey's position allows it to capitalize uniquely on global trends like friendshoring.
That's the practice where major global powers diversify their supply chains away from adversarial or risky regions by moving production closer to trusted allied nations.
And Turkey is uniquely positioned here. It is a committed NATO member. It's part of the EU customs union, giving it access to Western markets.
Yet it simultaneously maintains strong transactional relationships with Russia, Qatar, and other critical Middle Eastern powers.
This multifaceted diplomatic and economic network allows Turkey to act as an indispensable power broker.
It can translate its political influence into economic leverage, for example, using its strategic position over migration issues to gain concessions or investment from the European Union.
So, looking toward the long view, the economic potential is genuinely massive.
It is, but it's all contingent on stabilizing the domestic policy environment.
The OECD projects that, if institutional stability is achieved, Turkey could potentially become the fifth largest economy in the world by purchasing power parity by 2060.
The enduring tragedy remains that this huge economic machine has been denied the stable currency it requires to run smoothly, all due to policy choices.
So as we conclude our slow, reflective exploration of this material, the story of Turkey's economy is one of a profound duality.
It is. It's simultaneously a powerful, indispensable geopolitical force capable of negotiating billions from rivals,
And a domestic economy struggling with deep-seated, self-inflicted currency instability.
the core issue. When you distill all the financial and political chaos, it really remains institutional trust.
Without a reliable currency that functions as a stable store of value, the economy is denied its most basic, essential tool, regardless of its underlying potential.
It truly is like trying to run a high-performance engine without providing it the necessary lubricating oil. It just can't function properly.
The temporary stabilization that was achieved through all that geopolitical maneuvering and borrowing has indeed bought the government time, especially critical for surviving the election cycle.
But our sources make it very clear that the underlying structural challenges remain. Restoring the independence and credibility of the central bank, repairing the rule of law, and tackling that chronic high-consumption, low-savings trade deficit.
Those remain the true, deep-seated tests for Turkey's long-term prosperity.
And this brings us to our final reflective thought for you to mull over as we close this deep dive.
Considering the immense economic potential that is inherent in Turkey's geography and its talented young population, which form of debt will ultimately prove more expensive in the long run? Is it the financial debt, acquired from foreign rivals through necessary geopolitical compromise?
Or is it the social and intellectual debt created by driving away its own brightest and most essential human capital?